Good evening. Don't have my mic. Is my mic down there? Yes. Excuse everybody else visiting and talking and not getting ready, and I'm guilty tonight. Good to see each one. We're continuing our study in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Paul had been emphasizing that tongues were important. They served a specific purpose, but the Corinthians didn't have a clue what it was. It wasn't for showing off or proving to everybody that you were super spiritual, that you were a superior Christian. But that's kind of the way the Corinthians were looking at it, and he is taking them to task over that, chapter 14 especially, with their attitude. It should be with a view to edifying, to benefiting others, which is the essence of law. And he's summarizing. We got down to about verse 18 as we were concluding. I speak in tongues more than you all, and we pointed out that that was not the case. With who? Who is important in the New Testament that did not speak in tongues?
Jesus.
Who?
Jesus.
Jesus, that's pretty important. Did he speak in tongues? You see no evidence that he did. In fact, we've got the chart, I think, right here. Christ, John the Baptist had the Spirit. Elizabeth, Zacharias, Simeon, they all had the, and when you talk to our friends at Pentecostals, you just can't say Holy Spirit without tongues all in big bold letters right across their forehead. That's what that is. That's what they're talking about. I think I mentioned a conversation I had with a very intelligent woman, had a doctorate in linguistics, and we were studying this, and we were talking about the plan of salvation, looking at Philip going to the Ethiopian eunuch and showing Jesus that Jesus was the Christ from Isaiah, and that obviously included baptism because he asked to be baptized. And she said, and he spoke in tongues all the way back home. What? Well, look at there. It says he went on his way rejoicing. That's what that means. That's just the mindset. No, you can rejoice without that. And I think John the Baptist, Elizabeth, Zachariah, Simeon, Christ, the apostles before Pentecost had the Spirit. They were full of the Spirit, but they didn't speak in tongues until Pentecost. And those at Pentecost who spoke were all Galileans, according to Acts 2, whereas the crowd was from every nation under heaven. Verse 7 of Acts 2. Some of the Corinthians spoke in tongues, but not all of the Corinthians spoke in tongues, and none of the Romans that Paul was writing to at the time he wrote spoke in tongues. He wanted to come and so they could receive the gift that came through the laying on of the apostles' hands. The apostles hadn't been there, so they had not spoken in tongues or had any of the gifts. But Paul did. But what does that mean? I prefer to speak 5 words with my mind so that I may instruct others also, rather than 10,000 words in a tongue. All kinds of words are not the most important thing. Instruction, edification is. Signs, tongues were assigned to unbelievers, as we'll see. they edified the one who was speaking, particularly if there was an interpreter, and without the interpreter, they weren't speaking with interpreters evidently, and that just was useless. So he says, brothers, sisters, do not be children in your thinking. Now, sometimes what do you say to these Pentecostals who think they're super spiritual and you don't have the full gospel, you're just... What Paul says is you need to grow up. And he used the illustration, you put away childish things, become mature. And that's the church that puts away those things that were peculiar to the age when they were receiving revelation in part. When the perfect, the complete came, the partial will be done away. So, grow up. Be in evil, be infants. There's some people that think in order to teach somebody about evil, you got to have somebody who knows all about it and been a practitioner. No. Infants, you don't need to know about that. That's just, you stay as far away from that as you can. But in your thinking, be mature, grow up. Then he goes on with more specific instructions about those gifts that they were practicing that were beneficial. He says, in the law, it's written by men of strange tongues and lips of strangers, I will speak to this people, even so they will not listen to me. He's quoting here from Isaiah 11, or chapter 28, verse 11. What was Isaiah saying to Israel? What's he talking about? I'm going to speak. Were they speaking in tongues back then? No. What's this about? He had the Assyrians come talk to him. You're not behaving, you won't listen to the prophets. I'll speak to you. And the Assyrians spoke to them in a language they understood. And their language was nasty. And of course, it was a different language, but they were among the most cruel people that ever lived. And the stories of their cruelty, they make your flesh crawl. Delighted, especially with pregnant women, just slicing them up, staking them to the ground, running over them with plows, and then putting them beside the road, staked out, so that everybody can see exactly what happens when you don't do what they tell you to do. The Assyrians spoke to them and then led them captive away from their land. The 10 northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes were carried captive into Assyria. Many of them had hooks in their noses with ropes that were tied to the back of their horses, and off they go to wherever the Assyrians want to take them, and you just pretty well follow them at that point. And they did. He spoke, you like tongues? Well, God spoke to them in a foreign tongue. Now, what he's doing for several things. For one thing, he's talking about a language. The Assyrians had an Assyrian language, and that Assyrian language communicated in a way that they were not communicated to by the prophets. The prophets couldn't get the word across. The Assyrians did. When they came back from captivity, they knew better than to be idolaters. That did cure them. Of course, Babylon stepped in and did part of that too. But here he's talking particularly about those carried captive by the Assyrians in Isaiah 28. So then, tongues are for a sign. Now, It's not just gibberish or talking in the air. It's to communicate. God spoke in a foreign tongue. You like foreign tongue? Yeah, well, but it is a language, and they are for a sign, and they're a sign not to those that believe, but to unbelievers. Prophecy is not for unbelievers, but for those who believe. So we understand prophecy, and as we defined it earlier, and he did himself in the verse where he introduced it, it's about teaching and edification, consolation. That's for believers. But how are tongues assigned to unbelievers?
Evidence of a miracle.
We go to Acts 2, I think you can figure it out. It's
Exactly.
evident. We got everybody's attention.
Here is the evidence from that which you see and hear. Unlearned men from Galilee are speaking languages from every nation under heaven. And there are, 14 different nations that were mentioned there in Acts 2. And they all heard their own language. How did that happen? If Mike here started speaking Swahili, would folk think that's strange? How did he do that? Woo. I've tried to learn languages, and I've learned that's not my talent. I've studied 3 different languages, and I still have trouble with English. But here's people who hadn't studied any language, and they're speaking in all kinds of languages that everybody hears in their own language. That was a sign, and that was part of the evidence that convinced 3,000 people that the one they murdered is the Son of God. Now that's a pretty good sales job, which is exactly what Peter did. Here is the evidence from Joel. Here's the evidence from David. You think the Messiah had to be like Solomon to be powerful and run off the Romans? No, he had to die. He had to suffer. And Isaiah said he would, and David said he would. And he would die, and he would not see corruption, but would be raised. That's what the prophet said. We are all witnesses, and here's 11 men standing up with him. We saw it. We lived with him for 3 years. We knew who he was. We saw him die, and then we ate breakfast with him on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. That's not eyewitness testimony like somebody get a fleeting glimpse of a robber that covered up partway with a mask and say, yeah, I think that's who that is. 3 months later. Yeah, there's some reason to question that kind of eyewitness testimony, but the kind that we're talking about here is just ironclad and is the best kind of evidence in court. And you've got 12 men standing up. You've got 2 witnesses, 3. You've got 3 witnesses that say, I saw him do it. You're in a heap of trouble. But 12, that's just all game over. Here's the evidence together with point 3, that which you see and hear. Everybody hearing their own language. Proof. Therefore, know assuredly that Jesus is Lord Christ. I get disturbed with my brethren sometimes who talk about Acts 2 and they want to preach the gospel and they go to verse 38. The sermon was over by the time he got to it. The sermon was to convince these people they'd murdered God's Son. Therefore, no, sure, that's the conclusion. Well, what do we do? They were convinced. Now, in the Q&A, you get that, but that's not what the sermon was about. That is essential, and we need to know how to teach that. But we need to understand the sermon as well. It was evidence to the unbeliever. And this is powerful evidence. He goes on to describe the nature of that evidence in the next verses. He says, therefore, if the whole church gathers together and all the people speak in tongues and outsiders and unbelievers enter, will they not say you are insane? Has that ever happened today? Claimed to be happening. The whole church gathers and everybody speaks in tongues, and it's just a wild show. Have you ever been? Maybe some of you have seen that. Maybe most of you. The last one that I went to was up here in North Little Rock, a huge monster church there. And they do have pictures of those services online if you want a good illustration of that. And there's 20, 30 people at least all speaking at the same time, just wildly, with 3 or 4 up on stage, one pointing this direction, one in that, and a huge crowd. Paul said, "You're nuts," or at least that's the impression that you'll give to the outsider. I walk in and I said, "These people are crazy." A normal person who knows nothing about Christianity walks in and sees that. What is that going to do with it? This is nuts. But if all prophesy, now that's teaching, edifying, instructing, and an unbeliever or outside enters, he's convicted by all, he's called into account by all. You don't need to be committing adultery. You don't need to be committing extortion against your boss. He's convicted by instruction from God's Word. And the secrets of his heart are disclosed. Now, here's a person who speaks supernaturally, and the word of wisdom, the word of knowledge that he described back in chapter 12 would involve supernatural knowledge, and evidently involved revealing the secrets of men's hearts. Now, we've got a lot of people who think they can play God. God knows the secrets of our hearts. Solomon, who was dedicating the temple, said, "Only you know the secrets of men's hearts." Paul told the Corinthians, "No one knows the thoughts of a man save the spirit of the man that's in him." You can't read hearts. Now, we can see some signs, maybe reasons to question, but you don't know what somebody else is thinking. God does, but you don't, and we've got no business trying to play God. And most people know that. But if the secrets of a man's heart, nobody in the world knows I did this. And here's this fellow claiming supernatural knowledge. He says, "I know what you did. Here's what you did. Here's the names. Here's the time and places. This is what happened." Whoa. How did he know that? And he knew this and he knew that. The secrets of his heart are disclosed. He will fall on his face and worship God. I think that tells us a lot of things that people need to look at. So, in the first place, how do you get faith? Well, you got to pray through and the Spirit zaps you. Have this Calvinistic experience. That's not what he's talking about here. Here is evidence that convinces honest hearts, and they will fall on their face and worship God when they see the evidence. Now, that's what did the trick. On the day of Pentecost, here was evidence from fulfilled prophecy. It was evidence from eyewitness testimony, evidence from what they saw and heard. Therefore, here's evidence that convinced 3,000 people. Even though they were participants in the murder, they were guilty Now, what should we do? Powerful evidence. And Jesus spent 40 days after his resurrection with the apostles. What was he doing with them? Presenting himself alive with many convincing proofs. And then Peter turned around and used those proofs on the day of Pentecost to prove he was getting them ready to do the job, go out and convince the world. It wasn't about pray through. It's not about sharing your faith. It's about proving it beyond a shadow of a doubt so that person can see, and he's going to be miserable if he doesn't obey. So that's evidence of, that's what the tongues were about. And they could see supernatural revelations. Somebody speaking in languages they'd never studied, and the supernatural evidence of revealing secrets of hearts, they will fall on their face and worship. This is where faith comes from. Well, why can't we get people to believe? Say, well, we don't know how to show the evidence. Do what Peter did. You pay attention to the kind of teaching Jesus did preparing the apostles. Get prepared to make a defense as Peter commanded. Any other comments, questions there? I think that's a very important passage there in verse 25. It shows where faith comes from, how you get faith. They see evidence. And that the tongues are not anything like what we're seeing today. That's not evidence. That's evidence of insanity. The evidence that convinced people in New Testament time, you hear somebody that speaks a language he'd never studied and has supernatural knowledge about things that he could not know naturally. Proof that this is from God. Now, today we have the completed revelation. Paul said this is going to cease. And then he said, what do you do when somebody says, well, why don't you speak in tongues? Well, Paul said that was going to cease. He said you need to grow up, be mature. We have the completed revelation. Why do you need the partial if you got the complete? Which is what that word means, of course. Other questions? I don't need to be doing all the talking.
Okay,
Yes.
I
Yes,
just
sir.
have just a weird comment.
That's all right.
My
Yes, sir.
friend and I, years ago, when I was in college, we went to a place in San Diego, and people were speaking in tongues, and he was on stage and had people come up, and he was going to heal them. And my friend, they asked my friend if he wanted to go up on stage. He says, no, I don't, I'm just observing, I don't believe any of this. So he came down and talked to my friend, and he says, you're not a believer, you don't believe in this. And he reached out and he brought him up on stage anyway, and he shook his hand, and it shocked him. My friend said later, he told me that it shocked him, that there was like electrical shock, but there said that he was wired up somehow. You know, and he said that was just frightening to think go to that.
Gimmicks,
extent.
tricks. I've seen that. I got through my last 2 years in undergraduate studies working as a magician. And I don't tell everybody that. But we did some of those things. And you can put on a show. And there's a little gizmo you put in your palm. You can order it from the magic shop that you shake hands and they just almost light up. It'll definitely get your attention. It's about $15. It's not strange. It's not something that's supernatural at all. But it's sure, if you're not expecting it, it can give you a jolt. And naive people can be fooled. And things that are, I've had people tell me, I saw a person sitting on the pew, here on the front pew, and he had a bad leg, one leg was an inch shorter than the other, and the doctor was giving him extra soles on his shoes and different ways to treat it. And he says he prayed and he saw that leg grow. When you sit down there and everybody can just shift a little bit, and boy, it's easy to see. Yeah. I said, you're insulting the Holy Spirit. Here's a fellow lame from his mother's womb that everybody knows sitting here at the temple, and I see him every time they go, and he jumps up and leaps. Now that's a miracle. Somebody gets an extra inch as he shifts his hips and that leg sticks out a little bit. You think that's a miracle? The Holy Spirit ought to be insulted. Disgusting. But yeah, it's a con game, and they're playing tricks, and that's the kind of thing you see. So different than what we see in the New Testament. Told them about some of the things I said last time. Other questions or comments? Verse 26, what is the outcome then, brothers and sisters, when you assemble? Each one has a song, each one has a teaching, has a revelation, has a tongue. All of these things are not for putting on shows, showing, ooh, how super a spirit. They are for what? Edification. To communicate, to get the word in the head, to teach, to educate. This is the purpose of the assembly. Whether you're talking about a psalm, or teaching, or revelation, or a tongue, you've got to have an interpreter if you're going to have a tongue, and that means to learn something from it. And if it's somebody has never studied the language, speaking it, that's proof. All is done for edification, to build up. That's not the purpose of so many of the assemblies. You go there and you feel the beat and you boom and you twist and ooh, that feels good. It's about emotion, has nothing to do with understanding. Not a thing. Not intended to be. It's just to make people ooh and ah, feel good. They need to read 1 Corinthians 14, don't they? Whatever you're doing, the psalm, the teaching, it's for edification, to communicate, to understand, to educate. If someone speaks in a tongue, here's some instructions, specific instructions, which Peter said, there's some things that Paul said that are hard to understand. You get over in Romans and you scratch your head at some of that. Must be by two, or at least, or at the most by three, and each one in turn, or others say one at a time. How complex is that? I think first graders can understand that. We've got some educators here. Okay. Can a first grader understand that? By two, or at the most three, and each one in turn. They don't care. You do just 20 at a time, that's fine. Did somebody explain that to me? it's just as simple and plain. The explanation and I gave it last time. I think the only thing that even comes close to making sense to that, they don't know that's what that says. They don't read it. Why should they read it? They're going to get zapped with ideas and confirmed with whatever they think. Tomorrow, the next day, the Holy Spirit's going to tell them why do they need to study and read. I don't think they do. If they read that, how would they not be disturbed when they see everybody's talking at the same time? One is to interpret. And once in a while you'll find some who have read that and got somebody that interprets. They say they're not indicating that this was Russian, and now then they're telling you what the Russian says. That's not it. It's just, it's wild-eyed gibberish that is not a language at all, but I'm going to tell you what it means. Like, the idea of meaning is misused. Plainly, if there is no interpreter, he is to keep silent. That's just absolutely trampled, ignored, most of the time. Not all, but most of the time among our Pentecostal friends.
Don,
Yes.
most of the time they claim they don't have control of it.
He spoke to that too, didn't
And that's, yeah,
he? He said just exactly the opposite.
yes, don't do it, you don't have interpreters, you got control of it.
Yeah, most of the literature that I've read, it comes down to an emotional bubbling out that you audibly start speaking, and then they'll give you even some coaching tips on stringing syllables together to have the experience, but it's just an emotionally generated thought that's put into their mind, and then they believe when they get that expression. And so many pagan religions have had the same kind of,
Not a bit different, from the ancient Greeks to Oracle of Delphi, or most of these religions, the Eskimos and the American Indians, all spoke in tongues. That's an abuse of that phrase. Aesthetic languages in Greek it was usually referred to. But no, they don't try to control that. In fact, they'll tell you it's wrong to try to control it. One at a time. Most three, each one in turn. And if there's no interpreter, shut your mouth. Now that word silent there is the same word we'll see later on. Keep silent. Reading here from Bedag, to say nothing, keep still, be silent, stop speaking, become silent, was the Greek word silent here, keep silent. I don't think it's hard to understand, they just don't do it. Absolutely flat, don't even try to do it. And it's not hard to explain to somebody that they're not doing what it says. Well, yeah. How do you defend? Well, the Spirit said do something you can't do. That doesn't work. He continues in verse 29, have 2 or 3 prophets speak, have the others pass judgment. But if a revelation is made to another, and by the way, are they passing judgment on what the prophet said? There's people that claim to be prophets that speak, and you need to test the spirits, which is what John is saying later on. if it agrees with what the apostles have said, then that is the truth. And this is the way you know the truth and error. John? Yeah, there may be some people there in your assembly that say, I've got a prophetic utterance here, I've got a prophecy, and it says the opposite of what the Spirit said last week. Somebody needs to sit there in judgment and evaluate that. That's part of this process here in 1 Corinthians 14. You just accept it all. You sit and just make sure it is in harmony. If it's not in harmony, something's wrong. Truth is harmonious, and you get people saying things that contradict, you got error somewhere. You need to stop and figure out where it is. If revelation is made to another who is seated, then the first one is to keep silent. That's that same word again. Keep silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn to be exhorted. No more than 3 at a single service, but that obviously illustrates exactly what he's saying in verse 32. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. I can't control it. Spirit says you're lying through your teeth. Thanks. So I believe the Spirit. You're saying the opposite. Now here's what you say. Here's what the Spirit said. Which one should I take? I know which one's the truth. It's the thing that the Spirit said. It says the spirits are subject to the prophets. You say you can't control it. You got something different from what we got here. Now, the rub, it's not quite that simple, because what they're involved in, they don't control. There's an element of truth in what they're saying, but it's not this. This they could control, and they're just proving it's not this by the fact they can't. The trance state of mind is where the conscience just takes a back seat, and it can be reproduced in a hypnotic state, and has been in a number of studies in universities. UCLA reproduced the same phenomenon in a context where they certainly were not believers, but they just rattle on, and they're not in control. Another form of it is called automatic writing, where the arm just takes off and starts writing, separated from the conscious, and it's an insight into the subconscious mind. Sometimes psychiatrists will use that in order to find out what's going on with the subconscious mind. Get the conscious to shut up and sit down and turn off and let the subconscious run. And that's not easy to do, but if you can do that, then you can find out some things that may be causing some problems. And so when you're saying, yeah, they're subject to the problem, but I can't control it, and they're saying, yeah, well, they're telling the truth. But what they're saying is that what they're talking about has nothing to do with what's here in 1 Corinthians 14. So don't be so hard on them that you say they're lying. They're telling the truth, but they're talking about something that's a different ballgame. God is not a God of confusion. If you couldn't control it and everybody's talking at the same time, they're going to think you're insane, because this is confusion, and God, that's not from God. Which is, of course, the obvious conclusion when you compare what's being said here in 1 Corinthians 14 with what you see being practiced today. This is not from God. It is not. And I think anybody that reads this can see that this is not what was happening at Corinth. This is a language that has meaning, that people can understand, that was assigned to the unbeliever, and it's not a matter of confusion, and it is subject to and under the control of, and it's not just wildly flung around in all directions. But as in all assemblies, and I think assembly is probably a better translation here, the word church, assembly is exactly the same word. In this assembly for the exercise of spiritual gifts, which was unique and temporary, and in all churches, God is not a God of confusion. Whether you're speaking in tongues or not, you don't ever just have wild gibberish and jumping up and down, hopping over the benches and screaming and hollering. That's not the God that Paul's talking about here. God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in not just the assembly for the exercise of spiritual gifts, but all of the assemblies. And I see that I'm just about out of time, and I've got a passage that's going to take some time. The next one says, women are to keep silence in the churches, for they're not permitted to speak. Now, my thesis...
Good place to start.
Yeah. Just begin by saying that word women is probably better translated wives. It is not unique. It doesn't have to be. But if you do mean wives, that's the word you use. Let me look at some other places where that word is used. Whoever sends his wife away, give her a certificate of divorce. Here's John in prison because the wife of his brother Philip. Matthew 18. Here's the fellow along with his wife and children. Matthew 19. Be joined to his wife, the two should be one. If you're going to talk about a wife, that's the word you use.
Well, the context clearly states, the next verse, if they want to learn something, you have to ask their own husbands.
How do you do that if you're not a wife?
Yes.
All right. I don't think he's talking about women in general here. He's talking about, I think, the wives of the prophets that were speaking that had felt they were permitted to jump up and interrupt, and it's my husband. I think he's speaking specifically now. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, you have a similar admonition that is generic to all, and there the women are to learn in silence. It's a different word, but subjection, quietness, many translate. So there's a passage that deals with it, but this one also is using that same word, keep silent, like the one who is speaking and somebody else has a revelation. Shut up. This is absolute, close your mouth, which would prohibit singing or confession of faith or sins. This one says shut up. Now, the one in 2 Timothy is not like that, but it's submission, not authority over the man. That's where we start. We'll have to deal with that next time. Yes.
What was that scripture in
2 Timothy 2:12. If I got that correct, I'm pulling that out of my head.
Yeah, 11 and 12.
What's that?
11 and 12, yeah.
11 and 12. Okay. We'll look at both of those next time, Lord willing. Thank you for your comments.